Josh, you may start introducing him.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for today's webinar. We do have a special guest today, the Mayor of New Orleans, Mayor Landrieu. If you would like to go ahead and kick us off today.
I would. Thank you. How's everybody today? It's great to have you with us, and I'm sitting here with my wonderful partners, Tanya Tetlow, Pam Jenkins, and Commander Eckert, who have helped lead the effort in the city of New Orleans to reform our response to sexual assaults. It's been a very difficult time, not only for the country, but for local law enforcement as well. But we decided very early on this was something that we wanted to really get a handle on. We actually had worked up some reforms, then we went to sleep on them, woke back up to find out that, like bad weeds, if you don't stay after it, it's gonna continue to be a problem. And so we redoubled our efforts, and with our partners, in the midst of one of the most extensive consent decrees in America, focused in on response to sexual assault. And Commander Eckert took the lead on this. Tanya Tetlow helped work us through a very difficult period of time, and Pam and her team helped as well. So from testing rape kits to retraining officers to making sure that we had body-worn cameras and really work with police officers about how they responded to sexual assault complaints has really helped dramatically increase the safety that victims in New Orleans feel, caring for victims, also prosecuting perpetrators, and then making sure we institutionalize these reforms so that they never go back to where they were before. And of course, testing rape kits was at the top of the agenda because across the nation that is a chronic and an immediate problem. So we're working through our kits now. Hopefully we'll get down to a functional zero sometime in the very near future, but that's about resources and capacity. But I feel like this team has really put together a great prototype for the rest of the country. I commend it to all of you, and thank you for the work that all of you have done, and particularly to my partners who are sitting here with me today for all the work that they've done. So it's great to be with you guys. Good luck with your work.
Thank you so much, Mayor Landrieu. I'm going to go ahead and hand things over now to our facilitator, Amanda Royal, who is going to introduce today's webinar.
Thank you, Josh, and I want to thank the Mayor again for taking the time to come and present for us today. So welcome everybody to our webinar on reforming sexual assault response in New Orleans. As you heard, we had the Mayor of New Orleans just present to all of us. We also have Aviva Karash with the International Association of Chiefs of Police. She is the Senior Program Manager at IACP with oversight of SACI, the National Law Enforcement Leadership Initiative on Violence Against Women and Trauma-Informed Sexual Assault Training Program. Since 2001, Aviva has been training law enforcement, creating policies, instructive guidebooks, training curricula, and roll call training videos on violence against women crimes and enhancing law enforcement response. We also have Dr. Pam Jenkins from the University of New Orleans. She is a research professor of sociology and faculty in the Women's Studies program at the University of New Orleans. She has 30 years of experience with survivors of domestic violence. She's also a founding faculty member of UNO's Center for Hazard Assessment, Response, and Technology. She's currently the NOPD SACI coordinator, where she works closely with the NOPD and the advocate community to develop best practice and policy. We also have Commander Eckert with the NOPD and the Criminal Investigation Division. He is a 20-year veteran of the New Orleans Police Department. As an investigator for the majority of his career, he's investigated robberies, violent crimes, missing persons, and homicides. He's currently the commander of the Criminal Investigations Division, where he is responsible for all homicide, sexual assault, child abuse, domestic violence, juvenile, automobile theft, and white-collar investigations. We also have Tanya Tetlow from Tulane University, where she is the Chief of Staff and Vice President. She works on issues ranging from Title IX to athletics. She also works to reform the New Orleans criminal justice response to violence against women, chairing a task force for the mayor on the response to sexual assault. She is a graduate of Tulane University and also a graduate of Harvard Law School. She served as a full professor in the law school and directed the Tulane Domestic Violence Clinic for 10 years. So I'd like to welcome all of our presenters, and at this time, I will turn it over to Aviva.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm really pleased as ICP to be part of the Saki TTA team. It's been wonderful going around the country and meeting you all, and we are here as a resource for you. ICP has really been involved in providing training and technical assistance and developing resources on violence against women crimes since 1997. We've really been working to enhance law enforcement leadership and effective response to the co-occurring crimes of domestic violence, sexual assault and sexual violence, stalking, human trafficking. So as you all know, clearly the crimes of sexual violence are really complex, some of the most complex that you address, with the investigations requiring a trauma-informed, multidisciplinary, coordinated, compassionate, objective, and thorough response from law enforcement. You're all really playing a critical part. The crimes are really often perpetrated by offenders who are predatory in nature and are going to continue to commit these crimes and other crimes. And we've got some great research coming out of some of our Saki sites that is really supporting this. Executive and supervisory leadership from law enforcement is really essential in order to hold offenders accountable and provide victims with an opportunity really to heal and to find justice. We're looking at both of those. The Saki initiative is a critical part of that healing and justice. ICP has worked with law enforcement of all ranks to strengthen response to violence against women crimes with a real emphasis on enhancing response to the crimes of sexual violence. We work with law enforcement executives and leaders who really set strategic direction, operational priorities, and agency standards through our National Law Enforcement Leadership Institute on Violence Against Women. We work with supervisors and mid-management who really demonstrate standards of conduct, maintain officer accountability, and enhance organizational culture with our National First Line Supervisor training. And we work with both investigators who are clearly going to gather the pertinent evidence, facilitate interagency collaboration, and work closely with crimes, and responding those first responders who really have that initial contact with victims and who we see as critical in making and breaking cases. And we support all of them through the on-site training, technical assistance, and a 2-day trauma-informed sexual assault investigation training that we have been holding across the country. So in order to do all this work, we really think that agency self-assessment is critical, whether assessing an agency's effectiveness during an initial report of a sexual assault or during a cold case investigation. Law enforcement leaders must be continuing to evaluate and enhance all of the following. We need to be looking at agency culture to include myths and misperceptions around the crime of sexual assault, around victim blaming and minimization. We need to be looking at the selection of new hires and sexual assault detectives and looking at promotion and performance evaluation practices for the officers who are working with victims of sexual violence. Really need to be looking at the training at all levels, as you all know, of new recruits in service, roll call training, and really looking to include monitoring of officer performance in order to ensure that the training is really effective. We want to be looking at our first-line supervisors who are critical here, their skills to both mentor and train and to hold those that they supervise accountable when they're not doing as good a job as we would like. We need to really be looking at the policies, enhancing or creating those that we need to be adding to or developing. And we want to be really enhancing or creating systems of data collection in order to know how well are we doing, what are we doing well, where are our gaps, and what can we be doing better on. And then finally, clearly, we want to be looking at community collaboration and always looking to strengthen those. So I'm going to hand this over to our friends from New Orleans who are really doing this work. And I just wanted to conclude by asking everybody to think about, no matter if you're an executive or you're just doing your job at whatever it is, you have the ability to really influence and be a leader. And we're asking, what is your message on crimes of violence against women and on sexual assault? And then how are you communicating these priorities? And with that, I will pass it on.
Thank you so much, Aviva. I really appreciate that. At this time, we have our presenters from New Orleans, and I would also like to point out to everybody that the bios for everybody presenting today can be found in the bottom left-hand corner of the presentation. It's titled NOPD Cumulative Bios, and it's being moved around on your screen now. So please feel free to download that document. At this time, I'll turn it over to Dr. Pam Jenkins and her team. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda, and thanks for helping us put this together. And welcome to everybody. We've had a remarkable couple of years here, and I just want to open by talking about the role of the NOPD SAKI grant in these reforms. The SAKI grant application came at the time when the first reforms began, right after the 2014 OIG report, which we'll speak of in a minute. And then as the grant was awarded and began to be implemented was the time when some of the greatest changes were made. So the SAKI personnel have really been integral to this. They've been able to work with all three community groups that are working on this issue, plus with law enforcement. So the original SAKI grant was to certify and test the kits. We have tested 81 kits, actually, since I made this slide. And we participate in all three, the multidisciplinary task force, the Mayor's Task Force on Sexual Violence, and the SART group. And we've been able to hire personnel to strengthen this process both in law enforcement and in advocacy. The supplemental SAKI funding, which we just received and we're very excited about, again, is part of the glue of this process between law enforcement and advocacy. And that is that we'll do some trainings, some judicial trainings with local judges that we hope to embed in their current training. We will build training, a training team through our local SART, and a 2-day conference for lessons learned. The other part of this I want to speak a minute about is that what we learned through working with law enforcement and with the advocacy is that we lose survivors, and especially here we lose survivors that don't connect with services and don't connect with law enforcement, that are what we call transient, homeless, tourists, and students. And so we're going to create a model program, we hope, that will create other avenues for these survivors to stay engaged with the process. And finally, we got some much-needed technology upgrades. So that's the part that SAKI plays. We see these people, we go to a lot of meetings, we're involved in law enforcement. I'm housed in NOPD, but we spend a lot of time in the community with advocates. So how did we get here? We got here for a couple of reasons. I want to talk briefly about the OIG report of 2014, which the mayor, I think, briefly referred to. The New Orleans Office of Inspector General did an audit of the New Orleans Police Department, and they're documenting reporting of rapes to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, to the UCR. This report was devastating. The cases lacked supplemental reports. They were the overuse of the miscellaneous 21 classification. Supervisors did not identify or address problems, and the documentation was inconsistent. At that moment, the mayor, the chief, and this group that Tanya's going to talk about really went to work to change things. And the change has been remarkable, as the OIG report from 2016 shows us. These are their words. It was a remarkable turnaround. The NOPD resolved all of the previous findings from the 2014 audit. 100% of the cases had the right documentation, had supervisory review. The cases were classified correctly. This happened in a space of 18 months, 20 months. And the question that we asked, and we've been looking at, I was so happy to hear Aviva's remarks, is why, and we've kind of documented that a little bit. So how did this change occur? First of all, it's leadership and leadership and leadership. So it was the community advocates, it was Mayor Landrieu, it was the chief of police, and the people that worked with him. So it's political, governmental, and the advocate community stepped up. And there was a kind of collaboration here that was remarkable to see. We developed policy. They searched every crook and cranny for resources and extensive training. So how did they turn it around? So there are new policies, and Commander Eckert and I think Dr. Tetlow will both talk about that. There's improved training for patrol officers. The supervision, which Commander Eckert will talk about, really shows what happened here. And this was done in the context of partnering with the advocates. So the sex crime unit is now embedded with the New Orleans Family Justice Center, as well as the domestic violence detectives. This means that they work together on cases. If they're having a problem, they go down the hall. This provides better services and better law enforcement. We meet monthly with SART and with the multidisciplinary team and with the committee that Tanya's going to talk about. So what makes us unique from our perspective is that the community at all levels stepped up to address this problem. We're not going to talk much about SART or about the multidisciplinary team. What I want to spend a few minutes talking about is what Tanya will talk about, which is this development of the mayor's commitment to this change and what happened with the people he put around the table. And then at the same time, we'll talk about what happened with NOPD and the kind of deep change that happened there. So, Professor Tetlow?
So I read with horror the results of the audit of the Inspector General, and I should drop a footnote. Those results were made to look even worse because NOPD accidentally turned over lots of statistics that were actually sex offender checks that didn't need a report. But if nothing else, that had the advantage of adding to the impetus to make serious changes. So it made national news, this audit, and the mayor wanted immediate action and asked me to put together a commission to make that happen. So I looked, first of all, it was about finding the right people to get at the table. And for what worked really well is to get people high enough in their various operations that they had authority to make immediate change, but not so high that they were not going to show up to the meetings and not actually be able to prioritize this above all else. So we didn't have the district attorney, we had the first assistant. We had a deputy mayor who had enormous ability to make funding decisions happen quickly. We had advocates, we included a survivor, and it was all a great group of people who were very much going to hit the ground running and get the work done. So it wouldn't be venting sessions, because those needed to happen too, but I was eager to get the ball rolling as quickly as possible. I wanted very much for us to not create a report of 50 recommendations that would then be considered by the city. So our goal all along was to create a report, which we did 6 months later, of 50 recommendations, and literally almost that many, a third of which were already complete, a third of which were well underway, and a third of which needed more resources or more time in some fashion or another. And I have never in my life been part of a process that worked so well. So the normal hurdles within government that happen all the time, like you need civil service approval to create a new position, we managed to make that happen very quickly. If state law got in the way, we got state law changed within that 6-month period. If we needed more money for something, Pam helped write the grant for the SACI grant. So it was an extraordinary effort, and I think part of what motivated all of us, that I think most of you must feel right now, is this moment when everyone's paying attention, and we know from experience that that can go away really fast. So we all have this obligation to act quickly while people care, because that may be fleeting. What we knew at this moment is we had the absolute support of the mayor and the police chief and the attention of everyone to get it done, so we needed to act fast. We also were very eager to create lasting reforms that would be about making sure that it would outlast the current good intentions. The mayor referred to the fact that we had made real progress before when he first came into office, and that had slipped. We had somebody really good in charge of the sex crimes unit. He got promoted because he was so good and things, and there's a lot of turnover after that. So we needed to find a way to lock in some of these efforts. which you'll see we focused hard on. And process-wise, mostly we had the people at the table who knew what was going on and what to do. But one of the first things we did was we took all the detectives aside. Some of us met with them without their command there and without any city employees there, and really listened to them and tried to make clear to them that we had their backs and we were trying to figure out how best to support them, that this wasn't about attacking them, because half of our battle now is that they had gotten such a black eye that to persuade anyone good to stay in that unit or to go to it was going to be a real problem. So in terms of finding accountability, the problem, as you all know, is that you can't use quantitative measures as a way to measure the performance of rape, because you create weird disincentives to doing good work. So what used to happen in the battle days before this mayor was that the CompStat kind of pressures meant that the sex crimes unit was effectively disproving every reported rape, making it clear that it didn't happen. So New Orleans blissfully had almost no rape. It was amazing. So the problem is you can't create incentives that are about reporting or about solve rates even, because then you'll get police disproving the crime as a way to, easier way to solve it than to prove the crime. So we looked for other kinds of ways, both qualitative and quantitative, to do it. So the qualitative measure we came up with was one we just borrowed from the child abuse world, which is multidisciplinary teams. In the child abuse world, and so all sex crimes happening to children, we already had by state law mandated this team that would be the district attorney's office, NOPD, and then medical, psychiatric, advocates, et cetera, all at the table talking together about a case, whether there was more investigation that needed to be done, whether the case was just not provable, or whether it could go forward. So we wanted that kind of review of cases, that in-depth look into every single case. Now, state law prohibited revealing victim information beyond law enforcement, so that was the statute we had to get changed. And we're not at a point where we have time to review every single case that way. So we're doing spot checking at this point, working up to doing it for every case. But that is a very big deal because it gives detectives immediate input into the quality of their investigation, and they get immediate input as well from advocates about how they've treated victims, because often the advocates at the table have worked with the victim and know what happened. We had more mundane things like better case management software. And we had something quantitative, which is that we have an investigative checklist now in every file. So it asks questions like, have you looked at whether the person's a serial perpetrator? Have you tried to find surveillance video? All those sorts of common sense steps. We now have a way in the file very quickly to tell, and a supervisor can tell, and the auditors can tell whether those steps were taken. In general, we also looked at policies and procedures, and I'll start by saying within those policies we tried to mandate supervision. Now, you can't mandate good supervision, but you can at least require that the idea is supervisors will go over the work, will listen to interview tapes, will give feedback to their officers. So we've done that as well. The policies and procedures are really a work of art done by some of my former students who went to work for the city, of whom I'm very proud, but they went and looked at national best practices, and the policies are detailed not in a way that's going to be aspirational and not practical. They're detailed in the sense that they really instruct officers how to treat victims, and they make all that elaborate, and I think there's something important about having that in policies and not just in training, because it's very clear that this is how we expect you to behave. These are the rules. It's not that the trainer's making it up, and this is what we expect of you. So those turned out really well, and we, because we're under the consent decree, got approval for them from the Department of Justice. We also, our main issue in this department, and one that we're still grappling with, is like many of you, we have a serious manpower shortage in this department. That got made worse because of budget cuts after Katrina, and we kind of hit a tipping point where we were losing officers quicker than we could hire them, and we've had a real crisis with that. So we are building back up slowly but surely, but it's not easy for the chief to take, he would literally be taking detectives out of homicide to put them into sex crimes. So We have slowly built up to more numbers, but what the committee wanted to do was to create not just an aspirational size for the detective units, but a caseload. That would be ideal, because what we knew, and this is what in fact happened, is that the minute we regained the public's trust, that reporting would skyrocket. So that even though we got more detectives for the unit, what's happened recently is that reporting almost tripled in the last couple of years, which we take as an incredible measure of trust by survivors. We're very proud of that. But it has meant that the caseload is still far too high for our detectives. So we're trying to get there. We also looked for any way that we could carve out time back to the detectives. So I should pause and tell you that unusually for police departments, what we do is we take the entire sex crimes investigation, we place with the detectives for a lot of reasons, one of which is that it's much easier to train up a really fine detective unit, and we worry about training all of patrol of how to treat victims well. So we have maintained that system. But it means that detectives have a lot more work than would be typical in another department where patrol was helping them do more of it. So we looked for other ways to claw back their time. We hired civilian investigators to help. We also hired social workers. I'll come back to that for all sorts of substantive reasons, but they also can help with the workload because they can do a lot of calling of victims to check in even when nothing's happening, which takes time. And so that frees up some more time for detectives. And we looked for just simple ways, anything they were doing that took away from their investigative workload, we tried to help with. And we looked at ways to how to attract and retain the best detectives in the unit because they were really demoralized by this audit and the news that happened. So one thing, it's not enough, but we have a 5% incentive pay for the special victims section, which includes sex crimes, child abuse, which handles a lot of sex crimes as well, and domestic violence. So that actually was proposed, but it's already been approved and is in place. We so as I referred to, we've gotten the number of detectives up slightly. There's also been an increase in child abuse, but the caseload has now caught up to that because of increased reporting. So our detectives are looking at, we're projecting for this year something like 86 cases a year, which is vastly more than they should be handling. So they are killing themselves, they're well trained, they have more resources, but they still have too much work. So we're not out of the woods as yet. We did look for just general equipment. This is sort of a sad tale of a department that didn't have enough resources, but they were lacking just really simple basic equipment. And we figured out for sure that they could use the Sex Offender Registry Fund to buy more equipment. They kind of didn't know how much permission they had to do that, so that will help in the long term. We moved the entire unit of sex crimes into the Family Justice Center. Pam referred to that. That means that they're embedded with advocates, with a place that's really all about serving survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. It's a very different atmosphere, and it's a very different atmosphere in which to do victim interviews. It's not, instead of going to police headquarters, you're going to a place where there are interview rooms that look more like therapist's office, and there are advocates right there to provide services. So that has made a big difference. We have done lots of training, and that's about training the whole department, because while we ask patrol to do very little, they can still do a whole lot when they arrive on a scene to screw up a case. So they can treat the victim badly even for that initial tiny interview. They can mess with the evidence. So we designed a really good training for recruits, for in-service, and then we do, all of us spend lots of time with the detectives giving them training on anything that they ask for. So we're working on that. Some of that, as you'll hear, is required by the consent decree, but it's also something that detectives are very happy to get. And on sexual assault kits, that's an ongoing process because there have been lots of reform in the state of Louisiana encouraging every town and hamlet to finally test their rape kits, but that has meant that the state crime lab has been totally inundated. So we're up against not just internal resource issues, but the state crime resource issues. But we did do things to make sure that there aren't internal delays. So we changed, or by we I mean really the department. The chief changed the rules that made it more difficult to delay turning in a kit. than to do it on time. So if you delay, you have to fill out another form explaining why you delayed. So I'm a big fan of that, is to use the bureaucracy as your friend, make it harder to do the wrong thing. And NOPD has hired 4 new analysts to help with the current backlog. So it just takes a while to train people to test DNA, but that is underway. We brought in 3 social workers. The idea there is loosely to have them able to work in shifts and cover most of the week. And the way it works is that those social workers ideally will be going to the scene to be with the survivor from the very first moment the police arrive, and then to keep that case throughout. So this is not someone meant to do actual therapy. I worry that I assume that anything social worker knows is still Brady and within the knowledge of law enforcement for any future trial. But this is someone who's going to refer the victim to resources very quickly, is going to keep in touch with them, is going to treat them incredibly well from the very first moment. And the other thing we're excited about is that it will be constant kind of training for the detectives, seeing how the social workers express empathy and ask questions in a non-judgmental way. And we've encouraged the social workers to give feedback directly to detectives and to their supervisors in terms of how well they do those skills. Very mundane sorts of things, but we heard a lot from victims that if nothing happened in their case, which is often true, that they just never heard anything from NOPD. So we've designed something called a case summary meeting, that basically the moment that a case is going to the cold case squad, either at a year automatically or because all leads have dried up and they're not getting anywhere, that there be a formal sit-down meeting with the social worker, any other advocates, and the detective to explain that to the victim so she knows exactly what's happening. We are eager to do more to retain detectives. We have policies here that don't really create a detective track like some places have, some departments, so we're looking at whether that can be made to happen here. We're looking for ways that you can be promoted as a detective without being moved out of these detective units, because that's been an issue for us. We spend an awful lot of resources training up these men and women only to lose them if they're really good and get promoted out. So we're trying to find better ways to do that. Ideally, we'd like to follow the modern trend of having a blind reporting system, but until we get enough resources and enough detectives to handle the caseload they have, we don't want to greatly increase that caseload by encouraging people to blind report, because we know that would have a significant impact on the caseload. So we need to get our ducks in a row better there. But we're also looking at informal ways. I really would like, and I'd be interested if anyone else has this system, to have an informal blind reporting system for advocates and for the SANE nurses, where if victims consented to it, we could get their information, keep it, and come back to them if we know that this is a serial perpetrator and they're victim number 4 or they're future victims, and see if they then are interested in reporting to law enforcement. So we are still working on ways that we might make that happen. We have been lucky now in being able to retain our best detectives and to attract some really good new ones. We want to make sure that advocates start, once we have more people, knocking down doors to apply for the job, so we have lots of selections to do, which we hope will happen soon. We will ask that advocates be part of that process of selecting detectives, because we can train lots of people, but if somebody's absolutely ideologically opposed to the work and lacks basic skills, then we're going to have a hard time. And ultimately, once we have more people, we'd also like to take some of the detectives, have them focus on carnal knowledge cases, on statutory rape cases, and train them up for human trafficking cases. We don't have enough specialization in that. So we have, with all of this work, we had a big press conference at 6 months to announce the immediate reforms that were done, but the commission continues to meet. We spot check on the work we've done. We keep plowing forward on some of our long-term goals. We check in with the mayor frequently, and we try to make sure that all of it works well and that we don't let anything slip, right? Sometimes our motto around here is 2 steps forward, 2 steps back. So we want to make sure that this unbelievable shift, this culture change that has happened, keeps locked in. So with that, we're going to turn to the consent decree, and I just want to give a precursor to that before Commander Eckert takes over, which is that wearing my law professor hat, I've been one of a few people writing on the subject of discriminatory under-enforcement of the law. We tend to focus with DOJ Civil Rights Division when they investigate police departments on the over-enforcement of the law, of police brutality, of profiling, all of those issues. And I got a call from Civil Rights Division years ago saying that they actually were persuaded that they needed to look at under-enforcement too, and not just race, but also gender-biased under-enforcement of the law. And so Civil Rights Division, for the first time in New Orleans, but they've done it in Puerto Rico, and they're doing it in Baltimore too, I understand, is including the ways police departments don't do very well with domestic violence and sexual assault as part of their investigations into civil rights violations. So that's why these subjects are on the docket for the NOPD consent decree. And now I'll turn it over to Commander Eckert.
Okay, good afternoon. I'm Doug Eckert, and I am the commander of the New Orleans Police Department Criminal Investigation Division. Policing free gender bias and the response to sexual assault is kind of what I'm going to talk about. Some of this has been touched on by Tanya, and I'll try to elaborate a little bit, but not bore you as well. So the consent decree called for the NOP to respond to sexual assault and domestic violence incidents with a victim-centered approach in a manner free of gender bias. And I can tell you that the police department certainly has done that. We've certainly moved forward to make sure that that we treat everybody equally, and that the females that are the surviving females that are calling these complaints in are getting the empathy that they deserve, that they're being taken serious, and that we're putting everything that we have into their complaints. And I can tell you that's exactly what we're doing. Our structure within the department, I work in the Investigation and Support Bureau. There's 3 divisions under that bureau and 4 sections underneath my division. That includes sex crimes, child abuse, and domestic violence. And as we all know, in the child abuse unit, many of the issues that we deal with are sexual assaults of children. So the sex crimes unit right now, we have a commissioned staff of 14. That's 11 detectives and 3 supervisors. One of those detectives is the cold case detective, so he's basically handling the old cases and CODIS cases. Child abuse, we have a staff of 11 non-detectives and now 3 supervisors. We just increased by 1. And, of course, domestic violence with 4 detectives and 1 supervisor. The multidisciplinary team that Tanya talked about, that's a mechanism for continuous external input on the police department's response to sexual assault. We have monthly meetings with them, with the advocates and experts, and we discuss open cases, difficult cases, all cases that we have an unfounded disposition where the case just isn't not really credible, or we just can't get to a point of where we can proceed with it. And you'll see 21s, and that's how we classify miscellaneous incidents, and we really try to stay away from that at this point. And that's based off of the past and based off the Officer Inspector General's report and just the working knowledge of what the department's been through. Our meetings in the MDT include the detectives, the sex crimes detectives, the supervisors, social workers, our civilian investigators, and then everybody that's involved with the cases, from the members of the New Orleans Family Justice Center to the DA's office, Louisiana State Police Crime Lab personnel who process our evidence, and the same nurse. Major policy changes was, basically we stopped having police officers ask too many questions on a crime scene. We felt that they were doing a much better job just with their mere presence, but to ensure the safety of the victim or the survivor, to preserve any evidence that was on the scene, if there's any kind of description of a perpetrator, or if the survivor needed immediate medical assistance. That's the limit. That's as far as we wanted to go. And so that left the whole investigation for the sex crimes detective, so we kind of took out that middleman, and there was really little room for failure with that on our part. So the sex crimes unit, through Tanya Tetlow and her team, they created this very thorough policy, but not just a policy. They came out with almost a 20-page standard guideline procedure on what these sex crimes detectives are supposed to do on the scenes, or what they should do. They're certainly not limited to it. They can move forward with things, but we have to meet at least that basic threshold. So the detectives are responsible for providing a proper response, and we've gotten to that point, and we are doing a very good job with that right now. Our training, each detective is required to receive a core training, and it's 32 hours. It kind of goes into the drug-facilitated sexual assaults, strangulation. It kind of covers a multitude of topics, but it also goes as far as report writing. It goes to evidence collection. So these detectives are getting a wide variety of specialized training, and we're reaching out to advocates within the city. We really have a great relationship with them, and the partnership really has been good. And I think they're seeing a lot of what we do, but we're hearing a lot of what they have to offer, and we're working hand in hand. So supervision in the consent decree, that whole consent decree is really about supervision, and that's where we really failed in the past. And so moving forward, all of our supervisors, they're required to respond to rape scenes. They have to ensure that these investigations are being conducted in a thorough way, that it's timely, that the reports are completed, that while we look at miscellaneous classifications and unfounded classifications, we hold the supervisor responsible for that. We don't just leave that up to a case detective. So it's much bigger than a detective just saying, no, this didn't happen. And it goes up to the chain all the way to myself. And then there's things that we just don't have on the police department. And there really wasn't any way to track the cases unless we had a pen and a notebook. And so through this process, we came up with, we developed a tracking system where we can enter our items into it, locations, dates, if we have a perpetrator name, if we have a business name, and if these names come up again, either business or possible suspect or perpetrator, it kind of throws off a signal, and we move forward with that and try to start linking this. And it just makes for some of these cases that appear to be that just might not make it on their own, when you can start looking at them with possible same perpetrator, it's a lot easier to bring it to the district attorney at that point and try to and make some progress with it. This is just an example of the tracker, and it goes a little bit further on this. It shows when the incident happened. It'll have a supplemental due date, supplemental report due date. If it passes that date, it lights up in red. The supervisor's got to approve it. There's timelines for that. So this has been probably the best resource for me and my supervisor team to move forward to make sure that those checks and balances are in. Weekly, it seemed like for a long time this unit didn't get together. They didn't talk about any cases. They didn't discuss any problems. It came to a point where we have weekly meetings. We go over every crime that happened the previous week, and we also go over crimes, sexual assaults that maybe happened a while back that we're still moving forward with, and we're still trying to progress and get to a conclusion on them. And at these meetings we discuss where are we with the reports, what's the caseload, what's the clearance rates, and how we come with the CODIS HIT follow-up. The consent decree requires a considerable amount of requirements for us. So again, we can't use just a miscellaneous complaint to classify as sexual assault. We're very exact, and we're not trying to hide anything. It's easy to come back and change it if we need to, but we don't. That's very rare. And if you look in 2015, we had 9 with miscellaneous complaints. As of right now, we have 18, but most of these miscellaneous incidents involve HIV transmissions. And we really don't have any other classification for that. So, and again, this is just a compliance over time with the miscellaneous incidents, and you'll see for 2015 and 16 we have 100% compliance. Our policy 207 in the consent decree requires SVS, the commander and supervisor, approve all unfounded cases. So that really, that keeps us on top. That keeps myself and my supervisors on top of these cases, and so none of this is slipping through the cracks. All unfounded cases, they're all discussed with the MDT, and this kind of gives us. It certainly provides us with other routes, other measures to take, and it doesn't leave for the detectives. And Tanya discussed it. This was a difficult unit to fill at one time. It was so hard hit, and a lot of these men and women just felt like if they made the decision that a case wasn't going to go any further, or if it was going to be unfounded, they would really be chastised for that. They'd be disciplined for it, and the MDT kind of adds a lot, and it almost backs them as they move forward with the case, or if they can't move forward with the case. Our sexual assault kits they're collected by SANE nurses at University and Children's Hospital. We in turn send the sexual assault kits up to the state police, Louisiana State Police, for testing, and we do that weekly. Hopefully one day we get our own DNA lab, and I'm hopeful it comes sooner than later. But we maintain all of our sexual assault kits indefinitely. We do not throw them away. I think the state law is a year. We hold them forever. And last year, Tanya talked about it, we did make some changes, which is the mere fact that any sexual assault kit that's determined not to be tested, the detective and the supervisor would have to document the reasons of why they wouldn't be tested. The NOPD has hired 4 crime lab analysis, and that kind of takes care of some of the problems we have with the state police. Not that they're an issue, but with the state law requiring that all sexual assault kits get tested within a certain time period, it certainly put a burden on the state police crime lab. So by us hiring them, and we kind of came to the table, so we'll end up having 7 analysts at hopefully a soon time. That we've really taken care of our evidence ourselves. We just need a place to do it, and so it's working out good. You can see our sexual assault, the increase in sexual assault reporting from 2014 to 2016. It's a possibility we can we'll come in at about 1,100 cases, which it's a lot of cases, but it says a lot about where we've come since 2014, and of course the staff, and in March of 2015, the Child Abuse Unit had 6 detectives, and the Sex Crimes Unit had 7 detectives, and while we look at just sex crimes, sexual assaults, we all know that even in child abuse, I mean, there's more cases than just sexual assault. So those cases are also combined with what these detectives are doing on a daily basis. So moving forward, I mean, our big issue is trying to be sustainable and to strengthen our reforms, and we'll do that with the advocates, with Ms. Tetlow, Pam Jenkins, ensuring supervisor accountability, and the staffing is certainly an issue, and our Superintendent Harrison, is working to increase our staffing as often as he can. The training continues, and as well as the hiring for crime web analysis. So I think that the police department certainly come a long way from where we were. We're not perfect. We're not 100%, but that's where we are now.
Great. I want to thank all of our presenters. And at this time, we'll go to our Q&A layout. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to go ahead and type those in the chat pod. We did get one question from Lieutenant Summerdike, and he wanted to ask if you could please elaborate on the type of training you conducted when you mentioned improved training for patrol officers.
This is Tanya. I'm the one who designed that training and give it to recruits, although in-service is more every week, so it's harder for me to do. We do a few things. We're trying to simultaneously send them the message not to do too much on the scene, but also make sure that what they do well. So that's a little bit of a conflict in how we train them up. But we get around some of the ideological issues with them by really focusing on the perpetrators instead of on the victims. So when we talk about the experiences of victims, we do it more through the lens of perpetrators' techniques, how easy we make it for them to gut victims' credibility, of how they go about choosing victims who are going to have real trouble to report, and a focus on serial perpetrators, so that we make clear that we're talking about premeditated crime, not accidental drunken fumbling, and get them off some of their stereotypes. We talk a lot about the impact of trauma on victims, so they'll understand what they're seeing on the scene when they're interviewing them. We go over interviewing skills, and I don't think you can possibly get enough of that within police training, and my experience, at least here, has been there's very little of that compared to all of it sort of blends into how you cross-examine a suspect as opposed to how you actually question a witness. And so we do more of that, making those points broadly. We do an exercise where we get them on their feet to practice literally that limited interview, where we teach them how to ask, do you need medical help right away, basic questions about the crime, explaining to them that they're going to need to wait on the detective, trying to get them to be okay with not telling everything to that patrol officer unless they really insist, so that they don't have to repeat themselves to the detective. We train patrol on forensic evidence and how not to mess up the scene, and basic things like having the victim hold off on changing clothes or urinating. And then we look at report writing. We show them a bad report and make it into a good report. So we use videos. We use some demonstrations. I'll do a bad interview, for example, and we talk about why it's bad and all the outrageous things I've done. I really try to make it interactive and get them on their feet, because that's just wearing my professor hat. That's how people learn. But the one lesson that I put in there that I think is really important with recruits is I tell them, you know what, you're going to come out of this training with sort of the latest understanding of the department's policies and procedures and the latest research on how all this works. And some of the seasoned officers you're going to work with are not going to have that latest research. So you're going to be like the very young doctor working the more experienced doctor, but you actually in some ways are going to know a little bit more than they do on certain subjects. So hold your own, be polite and respectful, but don't let them convince you that somehow this isn't right. So to me, that's something really important, because it's all immediately going to be undone the minute they walk out of the training. And it's also very important that I never do it without a seasoned detective there to help me do it, and also just to vouch for everything I'm saying, because I can wear my former prosecutor hat, but I am not a cop, and just will never have that same credibility.
Great. Thank you so much for that follow-up information, Tanya. We also have a couple other questions. One is regarding your civilian investigators. Could you elaborate a little more about what your civilian investigators do and the criteria for hiring them?
So this is Doug Eckert again. So the criteria, first of all, we've hired the 3 civilian investigators. All 3 of them are former police officers that were actually employed with the police department. So they have some institutional knowledge, which is good and bad, but what we've been using them for, some of the duties that maybe we can take away from the case detective, so we're not, they're using their time more wisely. So if it's about transcribing tapes or listening to summarizing forensic interviews, maybe dropping evidence off at the evidence room, or picking up evidence, or bringing completed case files to the DA's office, picking up 911 tapes. It's the little things like that that gives our men and women a lot more time to do their investigation. That answers your question.
Yes, thank you so much. We also have another question. Can you elaborate on the pros and cons of blind reporting to law enforcement, and do the police support this?
So we had a lot of anxiety in the room when we discussed this in the commission. I mean, the pros are what you're trying to do is to get victims who are reluctant to come forward at least part way to give you the information about the perpetrator, and the whole point of it really is to find the serial perpetrators, is that you know then that you may have other victims and you can go back to all of them and say it's not going to be he said, she said, there are 4 of you, which can help them all decide to come forward. Or, you know, if you don't know there are other victims yet, there may be in the future. So that's the big pro. The con is that it makes everyone very anxious to be told, you know, Joe Smith is a violent rapist, but you're not allowed to do anything about it. And while I don't think as a legal sense that creates liability for the city, because that liability is pretty limited in terms of constitutional lawsuits, but it does mean that you can make the front page, or, you know, just publicly, it looks really terrible for people who don't understand the why you're doing it, of what the point of this is. So those are the pros and cons. We ultimately persuaded ourselves, at least in the commission, right? This never, we never got a final decision from the chief, but that the pros outweigh the cons, and we'd really rather like to know about the serial perpetrators, even if that makes us feel very frustrated that we can't necessarily act on it yet until we persuaded the victim to come forward. But the idea that you'll know, and then you can go back to her and say, look, you know, we really think we can get this guy with your help.
Great, thank you. I saw a few other folks typing, so we'll give it a few more minutes for people to get their questions in.
Well, I'll chime in just to fill time. Listening to Commander Eckert speak really reminded me that it's hard to even remember now, but in the old days, we never had this kind of partnership that we do now. It was more us criticizing from the outside, from the advocate community, of trying to persuade them, of the department feeling very defensive about publicly admitting wrongdoing. And this has just been a whole other world. We both have a police chief in Mike Harrison who says, you know what, I think we're wrong more times than I've ever heard in my life, and it gives me such hope because he really listens and is willing to think about what can be done better, and he's not afraid to admit that, and that's made all the difference in the world. And we just got brought to the table, and from our perspective, it means being willing to be constructive, to dive into the work, to really help, to understand the complexity of what they do. And so we're working from the inside with them instead of criticizing from the outside and really owning all of it together. But it's a great place to be, and it's the reason that we've gotten this far.
That's great, Tanya. We really love hearing about those wonderful partnerships that you all have together. I still see a few folks typing, so we'll give it a few more minutes. Okay, we have another question from Amy. Would Commander Eckert be willing to share contact info and speak with another law enforcement agency about the challenges they have overcome, or maybe contact info for a lieutenant within your department?
Sure, absolutely. So Doug Eckert, my number is 504-330-4836. And my email address is deckert, that's E-C-K-E-R-T, at NOLA.gov. And I'm available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So please.
It's a true fact. It's a true fact.
If you need me, please. Look, I think we only get better if we talk about it. I think that I truly believe that the New Orleans Police Department has made considerable headway, more than any other maybe parish within this whole state. And I think that at least we will be the model for what the rest of the state will move to. So please, and I'd love to hear some of what other departments are doing as well to make us better.
That's great. Thank you so much for being willing to share, Commander Eckert. We have another question from Mona. It was mentioned about those being promoted and moved out of the SACI unit, and there was mention about keeping those investigators so that they would not potentially be moved out if they were promoted. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Sure. So the way it's worked is that if they want to get a raise at all, and they so deserve one, the only way they can do that is by being promoted to some kind of supervisory position up the chain of command. And the practice was that once that promotion happens, they didn't want people being sergeants and supervising the people they had just worked with. And there's also a general sense in the department that they want people going up the ranks to get a variety of different kinds of experiences. So all of which makes sense. But our argument, and we're still working on this with the department, is that we spend extraordinary amounts of time and money with national conferences and our own time and training getting these guys as real experts. We make them understand all sorts of medical, scientific information, child abuse unit in particular, and then we lose them when they're really good. So we're trying to find ways, and it's starting to happen actually recently, where one of our best detectives was promoted to sergeant and was allowed to remain in the sex crimes unit. So we still maintain his expertise. He's a better supervisor, I think, because he understands the work. He's not having to learn it from scratch, because the flip side of that is supervisors often came from outside the unit and didn't know enough about what goes on there. So that's our hope, and we also think that what would help with that is if there really were a detective track within the department where you might move around detective units, but you could opt to stay a detective instead of going back and forth between being in the districts and supervising patrol versus doing detective work, that lets officers remain in that work and to use the value of that expertise without foregoing promotion. Because there were a lot of guys who loved doing child abuse cases, for example, who just never applied for promotion because they didn't want to have to leave that work, which is a level of self-sacrifice that we shouldn't ask of them.
Great. Thank you so much for that information. We also have a question from Nora. Do you know your submission rate to the prosecutor, and do you know what percentage of cases result in convictions/plea bargains?
Okay, so we submit all arrest cases to the DA's office, and we also do non-arrest consults for cases that we feel that are kind of borderline and how far they'll go. I'll tell you that the acceptance rate is low, and the plea rate is probably higher than the acceptance rate, so you don't have to go to trial with them. I think that's an easy way out. And it's bad. It's truly bad, and it's bad on the police department's part. That's something that we're working on right now. So we've been focused on almost trying to get the meat and potatoes of this corrected, and we've been trying to make sure that we have the right detectives. We've been trying to ensure that we have all our case files, that everything's documented. And while we should be doing everything at the same time, I tell you, it's truly been difficult, and it has been difficult. But now, I'm really a year plus into this, and now I'm looking more into, we all know what an A case is, that's twist and arrest, and I look at it as being warrants or cleared by exception. We know what a D case is, that's something we just absolutely have nothing on. My true focus right now is looking at these B and C cases and how we move forward with them, and holding the supervisors accountable, making sure these detectives are working these cases. And some of that has to do with staffing, that we're not staffed up yet, but some of that's an excuse too. So we can certainly do a better job, and that's what I'm holding myself to for now in this coming year.
And Doug is doing a good job of just focusing on the police department responsibility for this. I think the DA's office would tell you that they used to really struggle because they weren't getting the quality of investigation that they needed to bring charges, but I also think there's some work to be done there. And what they'll say is that they know how hard it is to get convictions because of juries, and that is true. I tend to think that that's not a reason not to push forward on cases where the evidence is there. I mean, it should be made public, the fact that juries won't convict in these cases, and at least we'll have an awareness of that fact, which might help the problem and persuade the public a little bit more to pay attention. Right now, a lot of the cases kind of quietly die with the screeners.
Thank you for that response. We have some additional questions regarding the increase in the reported cases. So what do you attribute the almost tripling of the reported cases from 2014 to 2016, and just the additional news attention to the issue, or are there other factors involved?
Well, we'll never know, for one thing, but as you all know, it's very difficult when all you get reported are the tip of the iceberg to measure actual rates of rape. But we had incredible news coverage of that Inspector General report about how badly NOPD was doing, plus there's just anecdotal evidence that was around the community about that, of whether it mattered to report or not. And there was a lot of really great news coverage about the reforms and the efforts done, and we tried to be transparent and upfront of everything that was happening, the good, the bad, and the ugly. There was no editing done of our report before it was released. And I think that we've just managed to regain the public's trust. So that, in addition to the commission work, there was also that other second Inspector General audit that showed an incredible rate, as best you can measure quantitatively, of report writing, of the investigative checklist being filled out, et cetera. So we had lots of good coverage of the fact that things are different now here, and I think that we just were able to get that trust back.
That's great. Thank you.
Can I just add, this is Pam, one more point, and we can't underestimate, one, the relationship between law enforcement and these community groups. So the SART group has over 60 members. It is putting on conferences. It is doing a newsletter. And it is that SART group that has gained trust for law enforcement that filters down to survivors. So that's one of the factors as well, I think, that's really been important.
Great, thank you. We have another question asking, have you seen any difference in jury pool's attitudes? Sometimes it seems like education within the department and everything is ahead of where the collective wisdom of the community is, and we have seen a lot of victim blaming type response from jurors.
So I think we have more judge trials than jury trials here, and I also think that we have more plea deals than we have jury trials. I can't say that we've had the jury blaming the victim, the victim blaming by the juries on this. I really don't.
I think that, so I've got very anecdotal evidence of this, but one of our clients in the domestic violence clinic was raped at gunpoint by her Marine husband, And the DA's office was good enough to take the case, marital rape case, albeit at gunpoint, and they tried the hell out of it. They tried it for a week. They brought in a national expert. They really did an amazing job, and the jury promptly acquitted. I think that the perception is that the juries will victim blame. And one of the things I write about as an academic is that I think that when juries acquit based on gender bias and blaming the victim, I think that's unconstitutional. There's no real remedy for it, but I think it's unconstitutional. And so when police and prosecutors fail to act because they assume the jury will do that, I think that's a problem because they're making sure that constitutional violation happens in anticipation of the juries. That said, of how we fix it, I often tell my law students that the people who decide what's on television and in the movies have vastly more power than any of us sitting in these rooms. It's about culture. I can't describe to you how exciting it has been to see the results of actions of people like Ray Rice and Bill Cosby. And locally, we had a football player, Darren Sharper, who was running around the country committing serial rapes. And all of that is finally breaking through in ways that I think will really help. But how to accomplish that massive culture shift, that's not about PSAs. That's about fundamental sort of, maybe training in schools early on, but that's really about our culture nationally and globally, and that I wish I had the answers to.
Thank you. You mentioned briefly the PSAs, and we have another comment from Sam. Based upon your answer to the jury's not convicting, have you considered any public service announcements or information campaigns to draw attention to the issues?
We should. I mean, just because they're not, a panacea doesn't mean they're not worth trying. What I try to do is I spend a lot of time with local media connecting with them, letting them know that when they want expert commentary, they can call me or a host of other people so that we can always be telling the side of the story that isn't victim blaming in these cases when they're covered. When reporters report such things badly, then I fuss at them about it and point that out. So I try to at least monitor the media. I write op-eds, do things like that just to get that message out. But it's really tough when you're up against, every James Bond movie and every image of women as being at fault or violence and sex being inextricably connected. It's an uphill battle.
Thank you so much for that answer. We do have a few more minutes if anybody would like to type some more questions into the chat pod. Looks like we may have another question coming. Well, this is more of a comment. Thank you for a very informative webinar.
You are welcome. You're welcome.
Yes.
It was our pleasure. Thank you, the whole RTI team. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you all as well. We do have a few more minutes if anybody would like to type in any more questions. But if not, I will see if Pam or anybody else on her team has any last-minute comments before we switch to our poll question.
No, I'm good. Tanya, Doug?
No, I think we're good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. And Ilsa also says thanks. Well, thank you all very much. We greatly appreciate you taking the time to present for us today. At this time, I will turn it over to Josh, who will go to our poll question layout.
Thank you, Amanda. I really appreciate it. And thank you to all of our presenters. You guys gave some fantastic information today. We are going to move now to our poll questions. You'll see that there are 4 poll questions there on your screen. If you wouldn't mind taking just a few minutes to fill those out for us, those are going to give us some valuable feedback, just some quick information about what you thought about our webinar and whether or not these topics will be vital to you taking back to your organizations. So we'll leave these up for just another minute. It shouldn't take that long. While we are waiting for these to be finished, again, we would like to thank all of our subject matter experts for disseminating their information today. Again, there was some really great information that was given out to our audience, and we really appreciate all of our subject matter experts taking the time today to deliver that. We do also want to thank the Mayor of New Orleans, Mayor Landrieu. He gave a great start to our webinar today, so definitely thank you for him taking the time out of his busy schedule, I'm sure, to talk to us today. It looks like the answers have kind of slowed down, so we are going to go ahead and move now to our closing slide. You'll see here on our closing slide is the word survey right there in the middle. If you wouldn't mind, before you leave today, just clicking on that survey button, that's going to open up a new window for you, and it'll take you to our short survey where you can provide us valuable feedback, not only about the content of our webinar, but also the delivery of our webinar today. Again, that is very vital feedback for us to be able to improve on everything that we are able to give out to everyone. You will also see there, coming soon, we do have another webinar that is scheduled for November 10th from 1 to 3 p.m. That is Eastern Standard Time. So be on the lookout for that. We will be sending out the registration for that, so make sure that you get that date on your calendars so you can join us for the next webinar. We will leave this room open just for a few minutes so that you can complete our survey. Again, we would like to thank all of our subject matter experts for everything that they gave us today, and we would like to thank all of our audience members. Without you coming to our webinars, these would not be possible. So thank you very much for attending today. We really appreciate it, and we really hope to see everyone at our next webinar. Again, please make sure to take the survey, and we hope everyone has a great afternoon. Thank you again for joining us today.